So, Workers Against Racism, what was it about and what did it aim to do?
Workers Against Racism was an organisation that we set up because in the 80s the issue of racism was being used to divide the working class. Racism was a very big thing then. It's quite difficult for people now to understand how different Britain was then.
All these skinheads, they're swearing, shouting and throw these stones, break my all windows, and all of a sudden one is coming here, I break my teeth in here, and there's the brick.
Physical attacks on black people was a very real thing, particularly here in the east of London.
Coloured immigration. The National Front is white men's front. Join the National Front.
There were many more direct instances. I think probably the most important aspect of racism that was there in the 80s was that there was, I would argue, more significant official, if not overt support, than tacit turning the other way for policies, official policies, particularly around immigration.
The core element of our campaign was against immigration controls, and the reason why we were opposed to immigration controls was that it was through immigration controls that racism was being institutionalised in British society, because what it established in the popular mind was that there was a connection between the problems of Britain and the number of immigrants that there were in the country. In other words, black people were being blamed for unemployment, were being blamed for problems with the health service, with lack of housing. And for us that was very problematic because, of course, the problems of Britain couldn't be put down to black people. It was down to the crises of the capitalist system, of the social, political, cultural problems that Britain had. This was a way of basically covering the real problem.
So, who was George Roucou?
George Roucou was a guy from the Seychelles who had come to Britain in 1975. When we met him, he was a shop steward in UCATT, in the direct works in Manchester City Council. And he had come to Britain in 75, I think it was. And he was a British citizen because the Seychelles was part of the Commonwealth at that point. What happened was he had to submit his passport to the Home Office because it had run out. And essentially what happened was that they lost it. He was instructed that he had to go to the Seychelles embassy to get a renewal of his passport, or a new passport. And by the time that this came to that, they were no longer part of the Commonwealth. So it was very, very complicated. So to cut a long bureaucratic story short, essentially they accused George of being an overstayer, that he was illegally in the country, and they threatened to deport him. It was very interesting because when we began to get involved, the other people who were involved, stressed the whole time, George is a trade unionist, George is a trade unionist. And we said, yes, he's a trade unionist, but if you want to defend him and get other people to support him, in other words, if you want to build real solidarity with George, not just sympathy, then you've got to confront the issue of race. You've got to confront racism because that's the core issue here. He's being deported because he's black, but not because he's a trade unionist, not because he's a shop steward. And if we're going to win his fellow workers to this, we have to confront that. They were very reluctant to do this, and I'll tell you why. Because the Direct Works Department in the Manchester City Council, which I think was very similar to other direct works departments, was quite renowned for being quite racist. There were not many black people working in the city council at that point. And so the trade unionists, who were very much in support of George, were very nervous about doing this because they thought that they would not be able to win that argument, that the racism would just be too rampant. So what we did was through their trade union, the head of the trade union, I think his name was Barry Gill, he was a great guy. We went and visited every single Direct Works depot. I think it was something like 56 of them. We did 56 meetings. The very first meeting we went to, and this was the salient lesson that we learned very quickly. the trade union officials got up and spoke about George being under threat for deportation. And the first question that was asked by this guy who was deeply racist. He came out with the most incredible stuff. He just said, why should we defend these black people? They breed like monkeys or rabbits or something, and I wouldn't mind going to the Seychelles. So why you want to oppose your deportation? This kind of stuff. And what was interesting was that this guy felt confident enough to get up in front of his fellow workers and make this kind of really disgusting, disparaging remarks. And when we confronted that and we started arguing, the officials realized there's no way you can avoid the issue of racism here. We understood that to get solidarity, we weren't saying, oh, you should be sympathetic to George and his family. And of course, there was a real human side to all of this, which was very important. But we were saying, listen, guys, this is in your self-interest to take this stand, because by defending George, you're actually standing up for yourself. We won every single meeting. We insisted, and we were the ones that instigated this, that every meeting should end in a vote. People had to physically say where they stood. And what happened was that the shop stewards who were with us, who had been involved, who had been reluctant and nervous about this because they feared the racism, what happened was that the racists became isolated. What the vote was for was that we wanted, in the run-up to George's hearing with the immigration officials, we wanted to organise a demonstration in Manchester of the Direct Works Department marching in support of a black deportee, which is what that picture is about. That picture is a young man that I hardly recognise. That picture is of us, George and his wife and myself, leading this demonstration, and there are 1,500 Direct Works workers in overalls and everything who came out on strike to support George on that day. And it was the most exhilarating experience, because to be walking through the streets of Manchester and looking behind us, seeing 1,500 majority white working class people supporting with a banner that said no to deportations was just fantastic. It had never been done before, and we felt rightly proud. We really worked incredibly hard to get there, but that demonstration was cited in the evidence that the immigration department gave when they agreed that George would stay in the country. They actually referred to the fact that this had taken place. So it made a huge impact, and it really showed that you could get results. The workers in Manchester, from then onwards, they realised through collective action they could actually achieve things. They started to believe that they had the capacity to make things happen. It just showed to us that you could win the argument with British workers, that they were not born racist, they were not irredeemably, beyond the pale, that you couldn't reason with them, that they were just these, xenophobic nationalists, backward or whatever. But actually, when you put the argument to them and you were prepared to stand and confront them, and not just confront them, but actually listen to what they were saying and put a counterpoint to that they were rational, that they could be convinced, that they could be won over, and that when you have that, then you have the power of people.
One very good example of a campaign for solidarity that I think was a demonstration of solidarity that I was involved in many, many years ago now, when I was much, much younger. A number of people in Birmingham, where I was living at the time, would actually go and make visits to asylum seekers in Winston Green prison. I might be a white teenage girl, in Birmingham, a million miles away from somebody who's just come here from Afghanistan. But I think going to visit those men in Winston Green Prison was a really important symbol of solidarity that transcended, you know, class, race, ethnicity, gender, you know, everything, age. And yeah, it was very important for those people in prison, I think, to know that people on the outside, people not in the prison, were actually supporting them. And just, I think even just the fact that it showed we knew that they still existed, that they were, we knew they were alive, we knew they were there. I think that was a very important expression of solidarity.
I do remember very, very vividly instances in the 80s where white people came to the defence of black people. For example, I was a student at Newcastle Polytechnic. Now, the National Front were never going to be a huge electoral, you know, party. And in Newcastle at that time, as it happens, there were fairly regular National Front marches. Now, there was Workers Against Racism that I was part of, and there were other groups, say, for example, like the Anti-Nazi League, but their focus was much more to call for people to be banned. Now, Workers Against Racism never did that, and they organised counter-marches. The more important thing, I would argue, was in developing the ideas, political ideas of why white people should take a stand with black people. That work was pretty invaluable because it meant that black and white could unite as equals, not as somebody that needed like a helping hand because they couldn't do it for themselves.
Cherry Groce's name is etched into the history of Brixton. She was crippled by a police bullet in 1985. An inspector shot Mrs. Groce by accident when entering a bedroom. Riots erupted and the area was again in flames for the second time in 4 years.
You know, the kind of racism that existed in the 80s, the racism that, if you like, was an official or semi-official policy through in institutions. I mean, not every institution, but certainly the, you know, police, for example, housing, for example, that I really don't think exists, or at least it doesn't exist on the scale that it did before. Most people just genuinely don't really think that much about race. They're not that bothered by it, you know. They don't really think, they're not bothered if their children marry across ethnic lines. Mm-hmm. They're not bothered if the Prime Minister isn't white. And they don't think you have to be white to be English either, as it happens. So for me, those are signs of the kind of progress that has been made, because that's a very easy, spontaneous tolerance and acceptance.